This is the largest fire season in California record and the largest, most severe fire season that we know of, even before documentary records, in the sense that in the past, there were years with frequent burning done by the indigenous peoples to manage the landscape, but they were not high severity fires like this that are having huge impact on ecosystems as well as on the communities that they threaten. And not just directly affecting people who live in and around the fires themselves, but millions more who are impacted by air pollution that they cause. Um, on the other hand, they're not unanticipated. So for the last 12 to 15 years, I have led the climate assessment activities for the state of California, specifically for wildfire. There have been 4 impact assessments conducted for the state, and we're currently in the early stages of the 5th assessment now. And part of what we do for these assessments is we simulate fires in the state on a grid over the whole state, month by month, for 150 years for a wide range of climate scenarios, but also scenarios around, say, population growth, development footprint, fuels management, and a variety of other topics. So, for example, the 4th climate assessment was published in 2018. We actually simulated fires, 100 million maps of fires around the state, statewide, as part of that. So looking at individual extreme events and seasons. And we projected that this kind of thing would be happening with increasing frequency. By mid-century, the climate conditions are such that 30 years from now, this would be potentially a very common event. So this is something that is deeply concerning when you look at the impacts economically, but also psychologically and in public health. This is not a world we want to be in where this is regularly occurring in the state. Climate change is definitely the primary driver here. It's true that there were many decades of fire suppression and land management that contributed to increased fuel loads, particularly on federal lands in our national forests. And that legacy of past management has resulted in a fuel situation there that is amplifying the effects of climate change. So it's the interaction between these other things we've done in the past and climate change that's contributing to some of the fire severity and frequency and size. But there are fires burning in the state and a lot of other ecosystems that are not as directly affected by past management in ways that would make them burn more severely today than they would have, 100 or 500 years ago. And yet they are burning more also. And this is true around the Western United States. So climate change is not a one-off thing that happens and then you're done and now you have a new normal. There will be no new normal. So the changes that are in our climate system that are driving our experience like we're having this year in our very active fire season are something that are going to continue to change at an increasing pace for the rest of the lifespan of everyone alive today in the state and around the planet. What we can do is take a two-pronged approach, multi-pronged approach. On the one hand, we need to do everything we can to slow down the pace of climate change by getting our emissions to zero and then actually getting to negative emissions. We have to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But then we also need to start managing our landscape in ways, more intensively in ways that will reduce our vulnerability and reduce the impact of the fires that we do have. And similarly, we need to start thinking more carefully about our communities, their spatial footprint, how we develop in the future, where we put new housing. We have a severe housing crisis in the state already. If we use it as an opportunity to infill in existing communities where we can create more housing options that are safer and don't increase the risk and the difficulty of managing these fires in the wildland-urban interface, we'd be much better off. than if we allow more sprawling development that puts more and more people at risk and makes it more and more difficult to manage these fire seasons going into the future. The lands are federal lands and should be primarily the responsibility of the federal government and not the state government. Beyond that, you don't do fuels management in chaparral or wet forests that don't burn more than once a century, grasslands. What you do is you create buffers around communities, and most of our fuels work has been going to that already. So this is not primarily a fuels management problem, and it's not primarily the responsibility of the state of California rather than the federal government. This is a pretty arid climate, a Mediterranean climate. We have a long summer, dry season, and the peak of our fire season, it usually occurs in the fall, when the dry conditions extend into the part of the year where the winds start to pick up as the season changes. And then typically we have a rainstorm that will put out fires and raise the relative humidity, wet the fuels, and basically bring an end to the season, the fire season. You might still get some small fires, but you wouldn't get a really big conflagration. And you guys may have noticed that has been failing occasionally in recent years. So we had the Thomas fire a few years ago in Ventura. That was the first mega fire in December in the state history. And we didn't have enough precipitation all the way into the middle of December to prevent an event like that. And it was at the time the largest fire in state history. So that is part of the story here for people really to focus on, is that the same things that are driving our increased fire severity and size and frequency in the state are also the things that are affecting our water supplies. Another way that climate change is impacting fire and our water supply is just increased temperatures means more evaporation. So as we warm up the temperatures and we're not really changing precipitation that much overall, that means that if you think about the moisture in the state, both for drinking water and for irrigation use and for wetting down the fuels, you think of it like water going into a bathtub from the rain, right? And where does it come out? It comes out as runoff or evaporation. So, and finally, there's a third effect, which is really that warmer temperatures mean that a greater proportion of the precipitation we do get comes as rain and less as snow. And the snow is what carries over some of the winter precipitation into the late spring and early summer. We don't have, if you go onto the Colorado River, they have some really huge dams, and those dams can hold back collectively, the two biggest dams, 2 years of the flow of the river, and all of them together about 4 years of the average flow of the river. In California, it's a different situation. We have a bunch of smaller dams on smaller rivers and tributaries, and a lot of our storage is really in the snow. So we manage those dams in California for flood control earlier in the season, and then as we get later into the spring, we manage them for water supply. And because we're getting more rain and less snow, and then warmer temperatures in the spring mean that the snow we do have melts out sooner, we're getting that snow melt runoff pulse earlier and earlier in the year. And now we have a conflict between how we want to manage those dams. We want to manage them for flood control at the same time that we're also trying to manage them for water supply. So we don't have the redundancy in storage in California that allows us to make up for this shift in the timing of the spring snowmelt. And we're losing that sort of natural storage of the snowpack in the mountains. And that is also extending our fire season, because now our mountain forests will dry out sooner in the year. And that can move the fire season back much earlier at those elevations. And we have a water storage problem as well. So all of this goes together. If you look at that really extreme drought we had in the previous decade, that was the strongest, most intense drought in California in at least 1,200 years. And it was greatly exacerbated by climate change, both through its effects on temperature and on snow, amount of snow and timing of snow melt, and then the variability of precipitation. All those things were basically enhanced impacts on this drought because of climate change. And that just underscores the insecurity of our water supply going forward, but it also has had a tremendous impact on the wildfires that we've been experiencing in the state since that time, because a lot of vegetation was killed. And so we have this standing dead vegetation, as well as the new stuff that's growing up and drying out in our dry season. And so some of the fires that we're experiencing this year, for example, are greatly enhanced. So they're much more severe because of these accumulated dead fuels from the drought and the related beetle infestations. It's that one party and one administration is completely divorced from science. They're not interested in hearing about the scientific conclusions about fire, about climate change, about land management. And the other is still traditionally a typical sort of party of good governance that is willing to listen to the science. And science, as well as our past experiences as individuals and as communities, is a primary way of understanding reality in the world. Right? So if you're not engaged with the science, you're not engaged with reality. And, and especially in a situation where reality is changing in unprecedented ways since our civilization arose, you cannot be successful in the long term without being engaged with the science. And that is the advantage of a Biden administration or any Democratic administration at the moment, is that they're committed to working with the scientific community and using science in designing policies to be as effective as possible.